The fiduciary obligation that presidents and trustees share with regard to athletics, I think, starts with the principle that one does not deal with oneself. That whether it's a matter of literal self-dealing or of self-dealing in terms of what excites one or pleases one or satisfies a friend or a neighbor or antagonizes a friend or a neighbor, that's simply the wrong basis for the kinds of transactions that have to occur. A board has to be able to articulate a vision of what athletics ought to be doing in the largest framework of institutional service to students, to its community, and so on. The president has to be, candidly, in a position to accept the fact that the buck stops with the president, that the NCAA rules and the broad principles of internal accountability say that the president is in fact the last accountable party, and that the board is responsible for overseeing the president, which is to say, assuring itself and from time to time assuring various publics that it has defined its principles and values, that it's done it transparently, publicly, and that it holds its president to account for those standards. It's always struck me that the NCAA rules are a pretty straightforward body of regulation. People talk about how thick the rule book is. It doesn't really come to the president's desk how far apart the stripes are on the soccer field. That sort of thing is embedded in the NCAA system for regulating sport. But the principles having to do with financial accountability, with adherence to principles of due and a proper process, and in particular with prohibitions on self-dealing, on conflict of interest, those things are pretty straightforward. They don't take a lot of pages. And frankly, nobody is shocked in the end by the fact that you cannot profiteer in any sense with regard to intercollegiate athletics. It's not rocket science to say that in some respects the whole system is out of control in this country. But that's not ultimately the issue that we're talking about. What we're talking about is accountability for the integrity of the programs. I'm convinced that programs that are not academically responsible eventually become substantial causes of crisis for their institutions. In any given year, one or another of our great universities is in deep trouble over some matter having to do with academic integrity. It doesn't require a thick rule book to know that if a student takes a course, the student ought really to have learned something in the course, that if a student earns a grade, the student should have earned the grade, that if a student is admitted to the program, the student ought to be able to do the work. The issue is how you enforce those principles on a day-to-day basis, and that's what presidents are accountable for doing. It ought to be. Now, presidents have to build internal structures of accountability also, but to hire people, to appoint people who assume the moral obligation to get this right, to have systems of accountability that are more than haze, and to be able to demonstrate to the public that this thing, the enterprise, has integrity that builds value in the culture. Those are the elements of the job. It's obvious, I think, that board members who get involved in internal operations of programs, who try to influence who plays a given sport, who try to influence what kind of compensation package a given coach is receiving, that eventually they get into trouble.